This is biodiversity, isn't it? One tomato, one species. No, you may say. Okay, what's this? This is biodiversity. It's still one tomato, or many tomatoes, but it's still one species. Yes, it is, but it's a lot of genetic variation within the species. And for tomatoes, we all know that some goes in the salad, excellent for salad, but some others are more suitable for pasta sauce. In nature, we also have diversity within species. These are actually the same species of fish. This fish is found in one lake in Iceland. And it has divided into 4 different genetically separated entities, subspecies if you like, or ecotypes. And you can see they are all very different. They all have different habitats, they do different things, they eat different things, they live in different parts of the fish or of the lake. And they are adapted for this. Here we have a lot of genetic biodiversity. We have the same with other fish species. This is cod. It's quite famous to most people in at least a country as Sweden. We eat it at least once a week, I think. But what might not be known is that it also has a lot of genetic biodiversity. Some are more adapted to live in cold waters. Some are more adapted to live in small local fjords around the west coast of Sweden. Some are adapted to the low salinity in the southern Baltic Sea. And as you can see, where we present a little bit of the genetic variation in one of the enzymes that they have, the hemoglobin, then we can see they are fairly different from different places, even around a small country as Sweden. Is this important, that we have diversity within a species? Yes, it is. Unfortunately, for cod and for many other species around our coast, we have depleted many of the stocks, the local stocks. Around our own coast in Sweden, we have a lot of areas where there is no longer any good stocks of cod. But in some areas, there are still. And this, to have local stocks of cod being preserved in one area, actually tells us that these are a bit independent from each other, these stocks. So when you, for example, do not fish too much, too intensively by trawling in one area, in this case the Öresund, you still have a very vital and very good stock in this area. While in other areas you have unfortunately taken too much of cod and there is almost none left. So this genetic variation has 2 kind of roles here. You can say that it has a role to send a signal to us that we can actually manage this fish species in a very local scale, and we should do so to preserve the local stocks. But it also says that if we lose a local stock, it may not come back just because it was local. It was adapted to this local area, local environment. And what will happen if an important species in the ecosystem, a naturally very common species in the ecosystem, like cod, will disappear? Well, in most cases, as for cod as an example, this important species has some role in the ecosystem. For cod, it is the role that it eats a lot of the small fishes in the ecosystem, and if it eats a lot of the small fishes, then there will be lots of small crustaceans left, because no one eats them. So there will actually be a lot of grazers around. And the grazers, they keep track on the fast-growing algae. So they graze off the algae from the seagrasses, and the seagrasses will remain very healthy and grow good and in a good condition. So to protect seagrasses around our coasts, then we need the cod. Okay, if you then remove the cod, what will happen? the small fishes will be too many. They will eat all the small crustaceans, and there will be no grazers around. And what this has been thought about around our coast before had been that we have too much of eutrophication. Now we know that it's also due to the big fishes that are lacking in our coastal areas. And this is, of course, just one example. The important species in an ecosystem is really heavy. They are really the crucial part of keeping the function of the ecosystem, keeping the productivity of the ecosystem. And for the marine ecosystems, we are relying on the natural system to produce fish, to produce nice environments and so on, because they are really natural ecosystem to a large extent. Well, the rare species, what about them? We are all often focused on the rare species in protective measurements. Okay, in this sense, coming to how important they are for the ecosystem, they are lightweighted. So you cannot say that they balance the more common species in this sense. Kelps are another group of species that are really important. They make up a three-dimensional habitat for many associated species. And along coast all over the world, they are really extremely important. If they disappear, the whole ecosystem will turn over to be more like a desert than a productive ecosystem. And we have investigated kelps and seaweeds related to kelps in the Baltic, for example. The Baltic is really a system that is poor in biodiversity. It has very few species. But interestingly enough, local adaptation of one of the more common seaweeds that we have, the bladderwrack, local adaptation of the bladderwrack inside the Baltic has actually created a completely new species. So there has been a step further here from genetic diversity, the bladderwrack being a little bit different in the Baltic from the outside, and then finally actually taking the step to being a separate species, a new species. So in this sense, also this genetic diversity is the background of all the diversity. It's the first step of creating new species. Within this new species, we can see that it's a lot of genetic variation. This picture is a bit complicated, but all these different colors and sectors show that they have different clones, actually. And some populations have more of one clone, and some other have more of another clone. And this genetic variation is what creates the local adaptation in a way. And if you compare populations of species that have little genetic variation, for example, a clone, which are all the same genotype, with those that have a lot more variation, for example, the black bars in this figure, we can also say that having more genetic variation, they are more resistant towards if there are changes in the environment, for example. So when we do experiments, we can easily show that having a lot of genetic variation will help the population to survive during extreme environments, for example. So there is a conclusion here as well, and that is that genetic variation is important. It's important because it also increases the function and the resilience of the ecosystems. And the genetic variation, which is more important here, is the genetic variation within a common species, those that make up either habitat for other species or is important for the production in the ecosystem, or may be important as regulating factors like the cod, for example. Well, when we are dealing with many ecosystems, we are actually manipulating the genetic variation as well. In the marine and freshwater system, stocking is somewhat a problem, because often when we release cultured fish or other animals, we have actually not the same genetic setup as nature has in this environment. So stocking a population, trying to improve the number of individuals, often comes with the price that we also introduce new genetic variation that may not be the best one for survival out in nature. For example, again, in the Baltic Sea, we have a rather big stocking program because we have actually destroyed more of the natural possibility for salmon to reproduce. So a majority of the salmons in the Baltic Sea are from farming. And these have other genes than the natural populations of salmon. And when we fish them together. So we cannot spare the wild ones, but we have to fish them together. And that is, of course, a problem. There's also another problem. That is when we try to avoid to take the small individuals in fishery, we also make some kind of selection. We take actually the ones that are growing faster, becoming bigger. And if we do this generation after generation, it will end up with actually the slow-growing fish will be better off. They will have a higher chance to survive. So over time, fishes get smaller and smaller in size. And of course, this is a problem for them in nature because they may have problems to survive, but it's also a problem for us because they produce less fish. So here there is a conflict between the short-term ecological gains of taking the big fish and the long-term losses of actually selecting for lower growth rate in the population. And unfortunately, most of the commercially fished species out now in the world have been selected for lower growth rate and thereby also lower production. So we must think a little bit longer in this. We must be more careful, not manipulating the genetic diversity as we do. And this is not unique to the marine system. It's similarly and even worse sometimes in the terrestrial ecosystems. But we have a problem. We have a huge problem today. Even if biodiversity is really a goal that all politicians around the world had said, signed more or less, we have a problem that the genetic level of the biodiversity is not dealt with. If you try to find out what are the legal instruments for protecting genetic biodiversity, if you try to find policies for handling genetic biodiversity, there's almost none of those. And this is a long-term issue because that means that we will lose local populations, we'll lose genetic diversity, and we will not be able to gather them back unless we wait for thousands and thousands of years where new biodiversity can be created through mutations simply, which is a very slow process. So therefore, a little bit of the paradoxes, and that is what is my message today. We cannot only focus on the rare species in protecting biodiversity. We actually also have to focus on the common species because we rely on the common species. And then we have to go to the level below the species and think about the biodiversity of the genes within these common species. And this is, I think, a message that we have to try to really get through for the politicians and the policymakers. And with that, I like to thank you for this.